Well, hi. I tend to be pretty bad at putting together slides and following the rules. There's always lots of dense things in it that are hard to read. So if you're interested in that, you can get the slides here. And it also helps you engage with my brand, which I enjoy to a great deal. But yeah, as mentioned, I want to go over kind of as you'll see, a collection of I guess you could say what seems to be best practices that organizations are following to not stress out as individuals and go so crazy. And hopefully, it's always a nice side effect with the people who employ you if you help them out as well. But as you'll see as I get into it, I'm developing this theory that like the organization should take care of itself, and it's better for the individual to not go insane. In the whole, like if you work with computers and infrastructure and programming and things like that. So I tend to think of this sort of way of talking first, if I can get control of my computer. Well, we'll go with this. So hi. You can see I need lots of therapy to figure out how slides work. But this is, I've actually been thinking recently that there's a lot been going on in the industry that I work in as far as things dying and coming and going and getting wiped out. And it does start to like try on the mind a little bit, especially if you work in the profession that I do, kind of thought leadership. If you want to know what a thought leader is, it's someone who tries to figure out the best practices and things that are working in an industry, and then they go out and they tell people about it. And they try to encourage them to follow those best practices and use those technologies. This is one of those titles where like no one called a thought leader would ever say they were a thought leader, kind of like an enterprise architect nowadays. But it's sort of like a vital function that happens in an organization. And like I said, I've been thinking over the past, I don't know, how old am I? 28 years of my career, 8 years more or less being in this role, that things have all of a sudden like are a little jumbled, at least from the nook of the thought leadership world that I'm from. So what I've tried to do is, when things get jumbled in my head, I like to go through and get the kind of like the basics down, the things that are always true, or do you have another rhyme? Like especially in this area of thinking about agile software development, DevOps, what we would call platform engineering now, even in kind of like community management and things like that, there's a few principles that come up over and over again that we almost have to rediscover each time. So I thought it'd be nice to go through a list of them because they all are trying to kind of make things run well, if you will, and to also make sure that the way that you're using all of the complete stack that you use to support the software in your organization, that you're doing it well and that it runs correctly. But more importantly, as I was getting to, that you're kind of keeping sane and right-minded in your organization. So I'm going to go over some of these. I'm not going to go over all of them. One, because it would take a long time, and two, because all I've worked out is the title for them so far, and I haven't actually worked out what the explanation of each is. But I think the big summary, if you follow DevOps, and I'll get to this. I don't know if you're like me or my children, but you may not recognize what that is. That's dental floss. I don't know what you call it around here, but it helps clean your teeth. But I've kind of realized over the years, as I've seen the sorts of things right now go through various phases of adoption, that it ends up being a lot like flossing, which I'll get to what that means towards the end. But if you can start to imagine like the role that flossing takes in your life, how often people actually do it, then it's very similar to the way that I think DevOps is used. So just as a brief introduction, this is me. A long time ago, you can see back in financial year 05, I was working at BMC Software, if you know about them. They were fun at the time. I was a programmer for systems management software, what nowadays we would call monitoring, log management, maybe even observability. I don't know. I'd probably would chastise because you really can't call yourself that unless you really know what you're talking about. But I was a programmer, and then I went on to be, I worked as an industry analyst, as mentioned, and I've ended up here I was at Pivotal and then VMware, kind of studying how people do their software, how large organizations mostly think about planning their software, building the infrastructure stack that supports it, doing the software practices to get their custom software out the door. And as I've alluded to a little bit already, like a lot of what I do is talk with those people and then put together research and document how it works out. And I think at this point, like I've become a bit of a recovering thought leader over the summer, right? Like I definitely am in this role. And so that's really what's kind of put me on this path, kind of in this weird spot to write down what all these principles are. So just to give you an idea of what that looks like, right? As mentioned, I started back. People sometimes are curious how they can become a thought leader as well. And this was in 2005 or so. I was lucky to join this company, RedMonk. If you know the concept that developers are kingmakers, or that if you know the RedMonk Programming Index, it's a little firm, analyst firm that works on that. And it's great. It was a good opportunity to very much so change my career around a lot, to be in this analyst area. And then, what you end up with that is I've traveled around the world too much, contributed to how hot it was back home in Amsterdam this past week. And I ended up working at Pivotal. I have a podcast. I've met all these great people and finally learned how to make transparent images out of pictures, which is very handy if you like this collage-y sort of thing. And I've had the chance to write several books and do things. It's been great. It's really been a wonderful kind of setup, if you don't mind speaking in front of people and publishing things. But it's really fortunate and nice to kind of fit into this community and be in this frothy world. But over the last few years, in addition to crazy COVID pandemic stuff, there's been a few things that have kind of made this whole enterprise kind of waver a little bit. And the first one is our friend here, Kubernetes. Now, I am not originally in my neck of the woods, my area of infrastructure. I'm not really originally from the Kubernetes camp. I actually come because I was in Pivotal. I was part of this, if you remember, how many years ago would this be? 3 or 5 years ago, there were actually many ways of orchestrating and managing and deploying containers. And the victors, the Kubernetes people, don't like to say that there were container wars, but there very much so were all sorts of other stacks about how we were going to do this. If you can remember 2 of the names of alternate things for Kubernetes, that would be fun. A little quiz for you at the end there. But I came up because I worked at Pivotal. I was part of this community called Cloud Foundry, which was a platform as a service that did many things similar to Kubernetes, but layered a platform on top of it. And it was great. I don't know, maybe you've used Cloud Foundry, but nowadays there's many people who still use it, and they like it a lot. It's basically like if you imagine what Heroku is and you wanted to run your own Heroku. It's more or less like that. You go talk to the people nowadays, and you tell the developers you're going to move them to something else, and they tend to barricade themselves in their offices and tell you that you can't come in anymore because they don't want you to take it. But what happened industry-wide is our friend Kubernetes came, and it basically blew away all the other container orchestrators out there and became the dominant way of thinking about container stuff. So this really if you think about the position that I have to get some free therapy from y'all. If each individual here sent me a bill, I don't know if I could afford it, so I'm just taking it for free. But it essentially took about, I don't know, maybe 5-6 years of my career, and just was how about we'll pretend that never happened, and we'll just get rid of it. So, since then, we do a lot of stuff in the community that I'm in now with Kubernetes, and I'm great. But it really does kind of take a chunk out of you if you've put a lot of time into something, and then all of a sudden it kind of disappears in importance, right? And so the other thing that happened even more recently, as I had earlier, I don't know if you saw this. This is maybe a year ago now or so, but apparently this other thing that I spent even more time on, maybe depending on how you count, 10 or 12 years in the DevOps world, it suddenly turns out that it was dead and it didn't matter anymore. Now, of course, it's easy for someone to write something about something being dead. I don't know if you remember, but Microsoft Office died back in 2002, and then in 2006, and then every 6 to 12 months after that until it finally stabilized out. But I think what's even more disturbing about this platform engineering concept is not so much, I work in marketing more or less, and so I understand how you want to carve out a phrase for something, a name for something, practices, in order to kind of like I said, I'm a thought leader. That's the other part of thought. What makes people not like thought leadership is you're trying to promote the thing that you're interested in. So the best way of doing that is to come up with a new name, a new label for something, and sort of be the origin of it. However, that's fine. That's just sort of like, that's the way things go. But what's mostly disheartening about it is the reaction that the whole IT community has had to platform engineering, which is they're very excited about it. And if you look through what it is, you're kind of like, that sounds like everything we've been thinking about since 1999 when extreme programming was like released, and then we developed DevOps. So like, what's been going on there? And it's not so much that people are wrong about this adoption, it's more that like, maybe in the DevOps world, we stopped trying or something? I'm not sure what happened. But anyways, the whole point is that like a movement like a couple of occurrences like this, if you're in the thought leader business, it's not very handy because it kind of leaves you just sort of not really knowing what's going on and having no thoughts, which is terrible, especially if you're scheduled to give a talk. Because it's right there in the title, you need to have thoughts. The leadership part's a little optional. But in order to get to that point, like I over the summer I was sitting down, and like I mentioned, I tried to come up with the thoughts that I think are helpful, and no matter what you call something, no matter what container orchestrator you're using, that they all still are applicable. Now, the problem with these thoughts, and as we get closer to discovering why DevOps is like flossing, or platform engineering is like flossing, or whatever you want to call it is like flossing. Maybe life is like flossing. We'll find out. But the issue with many of these is that we tend to intuitively, they're easy to believe on the face of it, they have often years of proof behind them, but for some reason, we don't really follow these practices. And it's really starting to follow them that becomes the key and the difficult thing. But nonetheless, I think it's good to go over these practices to start to think about how can we put them in place to follow them so that no matter what we're doing, the way that we're building our infrastructure, the way that we're using our software, the way we organize around that is helpful. So the first one is, this is a practice that's pulled directly from, like so much of what we talk about in IT is pulled from lean manufacturing. And I don't know, as a side note, this happens especially in this part of the world. I always think it's curious, if you work in software or infrastructure at a manufacturing company, especially with a principle like this, one of the things that I encounter over and over again, people working at manufacturing companies in software and IT, is that unless the actual business of manufacturing is following a lot of lean practices, they probably don't exist anymore after the 90s and the 2000s. But then you go to the IT department, and they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about with like lean stuff. We don't follow that. That's what the rest of the company does, which is always a strange curiosity. But this is a principle that I think, especially if you're a practitioner, the people with your fingers on the keyboard, or I guess mice nowadays, or trackpad, depending on what you like, you kind of know this, but I don't really see it practiced that often. And that is that the people who are doing the work, the people who are closest to work, are often the ones who should determine not only how the work is done, but as we'll see, what the work is. And we learned this in Lean. This is an example that the former sort of chief of doing Lean stuff at Toyota went over at DevOps Days Dallas, which is great. I was going over this in Iowa at some point. It's one of the lesser-known U.S. states that's famous for its corn and soybeans, apparently, according to the airport ads. And so this is a corn processing plant, and they wanted to put, they wanted to optimize, which is to say, save money and make more money by running things more efficiently. Sounds like IT, right? And so what this consultant did is he got rid of the picture of the guy, but he got the president of the company to go work on the floor for just a shift, which is like, I don't know, many hours actually. But what happened is after the president saw what the workers were doing, did the work themselves, like immediately he put in changes to the way that things worked, right? So the way that the factory was running, what the workers were doing, was not controlled by them. And the people who were coming up with the process and the control and the schedule, they'd never really done this work, sorting out the corn and worrying about it like that. But just as a very small example, something that the president, the executive of the company, and think about this in terms of IT, right? They are basically the programmer, the architect of how this company works. How it functions is their responsibility. But they realized that a 5-minute break was completely insufficient, because if you look at this, they have all this equipment they have to put on, and it would take them like 90 seconds to take that equipment off and 90 seconds to put it back on. And I have a philosophy degree, so I can't do math unless it's in Greek letters. So I don't know what that means, but it's a very small amount of time that you actually have for your break. You might as well not even go on it. So just as one example, the executive made the break like 10 minutes long. Right? It's these kind of things that you find out if you actually let the people do the work, determine what is happening. And as an example of that from the actual IT world, so this is an example in a commercial kitchen. I guess there's a commercial kitchen here that we might have enjoyed some food from earlier. The central executive team at this kitchen, what they wanted to digitize, they wanted to optimize how the kitchen was running. So of course, this was several years ago, what that meant was like, we should move from paper recipes to a tablet, right? I mean, that's digital transformation about 5 years ago, right? And so they sent the programmers down to do that. They said, put all these recipes on a tablet, but then the programmers discovered what these people were doing in the kitchen, because somehow they got that up at like 4 a.m. and went and observed the kitchen working, is they would spend a lot of time running around measuring the temperature of mayonnaise and chicken and other raw ingredients because, and think about, this is almost, well, it is an analogy for IT, there's governance called health inspectors where you have to keep those ingredients at a certain temperature for hopefully until you cook them. And so they have to manually go around and log what all these things are. And also you get a terrible customer experience. I don't know if you've had food poisoning, but it's not a great outcome for being a customer of this. So instead, because they were close to the work and they realized all this toil that the kitchen people were going through, if they could solve that problem, they could improve the governance, the security to some extent, of how the food was prepared. So instead of programming recipe books like onto a tablet, they automated and made digital all of the ways of measuring things, which did improve things, freed up kitchen time, and met the same goals of optimizing how the kitchen was run. And so it's because those people were close to the work, because they studied it, and also because they had the authority to determine how things were done, that it improved. And perhaps you work at a fantastic, enlightened place where you get to determine not only how you will solve the problems that are given to you, but even identify if you're solving the right problems, which is great. But maybe when you're talking with your friends and they're upset, you can kind of empathize with them and say like, yes, you're in a typical situation where you're not really running as optimal as possible because you can't determine how the work is done. But I think that's the first thing, that no matter what you want to call the practices that we do, the way that we try to think in IT, that comes up over and over again, is you have to push the decisions down as close to the people doing the work as possible. Now, going on to number 3. This one is pretty specific, but I think it is something I've noticed for a long time, that we don't, when it comes to software, the software that we're writing, deploying it onto infrastructure, even upgrading the infrastructure that we have, it's very rare that I see people who actually have continuous integration and continuous delivery. I've never really understood the difference between delivery and deployment. It seems like once you deploy something, you've delivered it, and you can't deliver something until you deploy it. So I don't know why we have 2 words for it, but we'll just say your build pipeline to get things into production. But I've noticed that most people don't actually put this into practice, which is kind of odd. So it's a good thing to get started with. Now, this is a chart that arguably started a lot of where we are today, kind of the DevOps world, thinking about whether you want to call it agile infrastructure, the speed at which we get software out the door, way back from 2007, which basically was positing that if you can automate the way that you do builds, your startup will be better. Now, when we work at large organizations, we often skip over the startup thing, but this is from the CEO of Chef. Great piece of thought leadering here, if you're interested in thought leadership, to have this kind of stuff out. But it's emphasizing that what you want to do is automate not only your builds, but the way you're deploying and configuring your infrastructure, right? And that if you do that, you will have a business advantage. The faster you can deploy things, the more times you can get your software out the door, the more features you can try out, the more you can make your software better and therefore make your business better, which sounds great, right? Like I think most people would say like it's probably better to be able to deploy the software that you do whenever you want versus having to wait 6 months to, in the case of some militaries, 10 years. Like it would be nice to write this software and get feedback about how people are using it. Now, so since 2007, if we look at, so how are we getting towards that goal, right? Like I would almost, there's all sorts of exceptions and footnotes, but I would say that probably the best metric, the best thing to pay attention to as far as the health of your software capabilities, and therefore all the infrastructure under it, is how frequently you can deploy your software. Again, you don't always have to deploy at will, you don't always have to deploy weekly, but it's good to be able to. It indicates the health that you have. So depending on the survey you look at, we've done good to not good at all, right? Like if you look at the DevOps report, the DOOR surveys, that's pretty good. You go down to the CD Foundation, that's more or less good. This is showing you the ability to deploy monthly or less. But, you know, for as much as people get upset about industry analyst groups like Forrester and Gartner, I think they actually survey the majority of people in the world. I mean, think about when I say Gartner, you're probably like, oh, what are they? They don't know what they're talking about. They're fuddy-duddies. They're people who are like working in these big, boring banks and insurance companies and manufacturers who aren't doing anything interesting or fun. And I would say like, yes, like everyone, right? Not like that small slice of people who are working on streaming music services or, you know, social media companies or things like that. Like they're the actual people surveyed that are normal. And probably many of the people that I talk with. So I tend to trust those analyst results more. And what you see there is that the ability to deploy monthly or less is actually like shockingly low, right, for where we would assume it would be. Because me telling you that being able to deploy your software frequently, you're probably like, why am I sitting here in the morning when I could not be to hear these sort of truth things that we all know. But I think it's important to emphasize this, you know, kind of ask yourself, in the organization I work in, like, can we deploy our software daily or even weekly? Like, what is our capability here, despite how good that is? And you can kind of see evidence of this. So this is, they don't do this survey anymore. But this is from the Agile surveys over the years, which I'm always interested in tracking. And you can see what's being shown here is the use of continuous delivery and continuous integration tools. So build automation and the ability to deploy the software. And you see two interesting things. One, the use of just build automation. I mean, I guess there's people out there who don't automate their builds, which is weird. But you can see the tool usage for that has kind of flattened out at about let's say, you know, between 50 and 60% over the years, right? Which is sort of weird. But then you also see that we haven't been automatically deploying or delivering, if you prefer that D, to production that much, and it's rising and rising, right? And we're probably in this now. We're like, if only 60% of people have the ability to automate their builds, at some point, I don't think you can do continuous delivery and deployment unless you've automated your builds. So you need at least that, right? I guess I do talk to people frequently who actually just copy their code to production, which I guess that's a way of deploying. If you have someone who can just like copy files, that's fast, I guess, depending on how things do. But you typically want to automate that so that you have more controls over it. Anyhow, the point here being that, like, we all know it's good to automate the way you deliver and deploy your software. And when I look out, when I talk with people, I hear this all the time. But if you look at surveys as well, you can see that many organizations don't do that, right? And definitely, that's almost like if you're not having full CI/CD in place, that's the first thing to really pay attention to and the change to put in place, no matter what you want to call the school of sort of IT that you're following. Now, this next one isn't really so much on the technology side, but more on the strategy side of technologies that you choose. And I think, again, as a recovering thought leader, I can see how I have been part of this problem, and my fellow thought leaders and people have been part of this problem. But in IT, we very much have this idea that what we need to do is put the best thing in place as soon as possible, because essentially there's so many threats out there that if we don't have the best IT running, then some competitors will come in and destroy our organization. I don't know if you've ever encountered these two phrases. They're very popular phrases in kind of like the world of DevOps and Agile and software. And mysteriously, the people who are saying this are people who always want to change, right? Like it's great that software's eating the world since 2010. I think it's always better to eat other things than be eaten yourself. It's a much better perspective. And oftentimes, this other quote, which is a loose interpretation from a Deming thing, is that unless you change the way that you're working, as this survival's not mandatory thing comes, your organization will perish. So you can decide to operate and work better, to put CI/CD in place. So these other startups are going to come along and destroy your organization, which is kind of like a bummer if you're just an individual in an organization. I think wouldn't it be nice if survival was mandatory? That would be pretty wonderful. But the way that we started talking about this several years ago was we would use charts like this, which show the average lifespan of a company, on the S&P 500, just one representation, but basically the prominence of a company and its success. And what we were trying to talk about was that as time goes on, there's more people will use the term disruption, which means a very specific thing in business strategy. But it basically means a competitor will come around and in a very short amount of time really ruin your business because you didn't change and adopt the way that you were working, because you kept using WebSphere or something instead of using some other better framework out there. Whatever, probably someone who wants to use whatever a WASM is like, hey, look at this chart. We should start using that or we're going to die, right? And what actually turned out over the years, this is me, for those paying attention, you can see the shirt has lasted longer than this notion. This is the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, which is a large bank, if you don't know who they are. And this is even way back. This is more of the attitude that large organizations had. They're like, yeah, we get it. There's people who are trying to come in and compete with us as a bank. And we're aware of that's happening. And so, we're fine. We're going to actually put changes in place, and we'll do pretty good at programming. And I don't know about you, if you've used some of these disruptive fintech companies that were going to come and destroy JP Morgan Chase. I moved to Amsterdam about 5 years ago, so I signed up with a whole bunch of new banks. So I was like, I'm going to use some of these fintech banks. So I signed up with several of them, and it was fun. Their software was cool. It was great. But then, a couple days later, I was like, oh, right, it's a bank. It has my money, and then I pay my money over here. It hasn't actually done anything, right? There's not anything super new and interesting about it. And I think with banks, a lot of that is because really what a bank does, if you work in any sort of financial thing, is their main job is to not lose your money, which really means they have a lot of regulation and compliance. You don't really want your bank to come up with interesting ways of banking. That's innovation that's good for someone else to do, not you. I don't want my bank to figure out, to do the kind of, what's the word? Darwinian innovation of a business model. It's good if they just are boring. And so anyways, the point being that if you had kind of dramatically changed the way that you were banking or dramatically changed the way you were doing things, it may have been a little difficult for you along the way, as I'll get into here. The other thing to look at is if you've ever been involved in cloud migration plans or things like that. Now, working from VMware, you're probably here is some good multi-layer thought leadership where you're telling us that public cloud is maybe not the best thing possible. But the part of VMware that I work in is very interested in you using public cloud. So you should do that. There's my obligatory VMware talk. Anyhow, you look at this chart, and what's going on here is this is a collection, again, over the years. That's the best thing to do with surveys, is you want a good 5-10-year window on a survey, not a 2-year window. But you can see that Benedict Evans has collected together the plans of CIOs to move the majority of their, a lot of their workload to public cloud. And you can see that for about 10 years, it's always going to happen in the next 2 years. And I don't know if anecdotally you have heard this as well, but I talk with people every year who are just going to, move 50% of their workloads to public cloud all the time. And then as you can see, that doesn't really happen. Kind of like with CI/CD, it sort of levels off at some point, and they kind of keep replanning to do this over and over again. And this is, again, not to tell you that you shouldn't be aspiring to this or doing it, but it kind of gets to the calming, better living part of this, is just you can take a long time Don't worry, like really make sure you understand the true urgency of something. Because it turns out that it's not often as urgent as the person who wants you to change might be going over, right? There's a different kind of analysis to go through. And that analysis, I think, especially if you're working at just like, again, a normal large organization, I think is to be comfortable with taking a while to change things. And the way that I think through that is I think a lot about this diffusion of innovation curve, which is adopted by Jeffrey Moore into this theory of strategy for software companies called Crossing the Chasm. It's a great read if you're interested in that. It'll tell you exactly, even though it was written in the late 90s, or maybe early 2000s, it'll tell you how all tech companies, not the consumer tech companies, but the infrastructure tech companies, cloud and companies like that, how they think and operate. But it goes over this. And this is basically, I mean, y'all seem like a smart bunch. Anytime you see a smooth curve, you should immediately think this is not correct, right? There are no smooth curves in nature, but it's just representative. It's a model. But generally what happens when you have a new technology out is you have these innovators and early adopters, right? And they will put up with anything just to use a new technology, right? They'll, put up with all the hassles of it. They won't even think that it's a hassle. Just the joy of tinkering and making something work is what they like, right? So they don't care what state the technology is in. If it works after a year, they're just interested in doing that, which is great. Like, we need that, very much so, people to innovate and explore and do things. But as you go along this curve, we even use terms which are, no one wants to be a laggard, right? I mean, raise your hand if you're like, yes, I'd like being a laggard. I would more think of as the technology gets to be more understood, more figured out, less error prone. What you are is like wise. We should call these people the wise people over here, because they are using that. Again, let's think about banking. I don't want my bank to be innovating on a new technology there. I want them to wisely use it. So I think it's helpful to think about, at what point is this technology mature? How can I be more of the late majority than the laggards? Because the stack that I'm using is a lot more stable. And now, this may sound like I'm contradicting what I was saying about CI/CD, and I think it's important to know that at some point, you're not a laggard, you're just very stubborn, right? So if we look at the history of CI/CD all the way back to when ThoughtWorks open source cruise control and going through, Hudson and Jenkins and all this, like, automating your build pipeline has been well understood for a long time. So at some point, you do need to adopt those technologies there. But I think more recently, there's another good example that we all kind of know. This is a tip that they give you about slides, is you should never put up a chart that your audience can't read. But what they don't tell you about that is that it means that you can tell them what you want them to think about it, which I will demonstrate right now. This is from our State of Kubernetes survey, about 5 years of surveys. And what you see here, again, over the course of 4 years, not just one data point, is that the benefits of Kubernetes, as far as shortening your software development cycles, have not always been too great. And in fact, they're going down, right? And the reason you would put something like that in place, instead of just not, is because you want to improve things. So again, using the metric I like, how quickly can you put software out the door, it's been not turning out very well as you go across that cycle. Now, as you can see, it's going in the right direction, so hopefully it'll start climbing back up. Now, I think what's happening here is as you go into the majority, more and more people are using it, not just those early innovators who will put up with anything. You have people who don't want to put up with anything. They're expecting to use this technology and for it to just work as advertised. But instead, they encounter all sorts of issues that they need to work with. But again, it's getting better. At this phase, it probably is at the point where you have crossed over that chasm there, and it's ready to start using and working. But the reason this happens is because if you're familiar with Kubernetes or any sort of thing in this area, it turns out that it does a very small part of that overall stack that you need to get software out the door, right? This is from Torsten here, just most recent chart kind of demonstrating what it is. So you see the core of what it does, and it does it very well, but it doesn't do all of these other things. It's something that you have to integrate and do yourself. Now, here's another little insider thing. People like to use this landscape chart. from the Cloud Native Computing Foundation to be like, ooh, scary, you should freak out and buy stuff from me instead of worrying about this. But in fact, I think this is fantastic. This is what you want when you're developing a new technology, right? You want as many people trying as many things as possible, right? You want to try out things until you winnow down to what actually works. And the point being that as we start to winnow this down, we have less and less. We know the components needed to build out this entire stack of how you want to run your software. And you want to winnow down to like 2 or 3 options or so that are the main options, and how to integrate them together, right? Like, you're an early adopter. You have to put up with a bunch of, basically you're innovating the platform instead of just using it. And I think that's a lot of the issue that you have, and why it's a good example, a good historic example of, like, you probably didn't want to start using Kubernetes 4 years ago, right? That would be a lot of work on your part, versus now starting to use it is probably a good idea to get the advantages of it. And then the crazy thing is, if you look over the years, what all of the Kubernetes thought leaders have said, they've basically been telling us exactly this the whole time. Right? They've been saying, hey, we actually do this thing over here, and you think we do all of this other stuff and we're going to be magic. But you should not think that, right? I mean, if you look at the documentary, basically Kubernetes started off as a strategy to neutralize competitive advantage that AWS had, right? Like, it wasn't necessarily intended for every large organization to use on their own to build their own cloud. Kind of like OpenStack as another historic analogy. It was just intended as a way for the big public cloud providers to have something to compete with. And then, of course, you see, as application developers, those early adopters who will do anything get fascinated. In the middle there, you see the advice of like, hey, you're supposed to build a whole platform on top of this, not just use it on its own if you want to do application stuff. And then finally, a couple years ago, you see the kind of like, yeah, as far as developers interacting with this directly, that was never really the intention, but it kind of ran off on its own to turn out to be that way. So the point being that generally, it's better, especially for your own sanity, to sort of like be a late adopter, right? To kind of watch a new technology developing, see how the issues people have, the benefits they have, see what winnows out, and really kind of slowly wait till it's mature to start using it. And in fact, this is what I see at large organizations all the time, whether it's militaries like the Air Force or DIY stores like Home Depot, or I just saw this just last week at John Deere. This is their kind of a representation of them deploying out, doing not only agile software, but the infrastructure that comes with it. They did it over the course of like 3 or 4 years, slowly in little groups, training them and deploying them out and figuring out how that technology and how that way of working would work in their organization, instead of doing it all at once. And it's worked out quite well for them. But think in terms of not just like 6 months or even a year, but when you're doing a dramatic shift of your infrastructure, think in terms of like 3 years or more, right? Like, as we roll this out to thousands of people and many applications, what is that going to end up looking like? So, to wrap up, like I said, I'm not going to go over all of those, but how is DevOps like flossing? Now, it's the lucky for you that I'm so far away from you, because I'll make an admission. I don't floss. I've done it before. I know the mechanics of it. I know you got these great new technologies of picks and things like that. The Dutch dentists are always trying to get me to put this piece of wood in between my teeth to space it out or something. And I don't know. I don't know how it is here, but every time I go to the dentist, it's basically just like, I'm going to pay someone to yell at me and tell me why I'm a terrible person. That's my experience with dentists. But just like all those practices and like flossing, it's something that we know is good, that we should be doing. I'm sure everyone here flosses. You can raise your hand in your mind if you floss, just so that you're safe. But like, probably you don't. Like, I think most people that I've ever met don't actually floss after every single meal, despite us knowing that it's exactly what we should be doing too. As a former manager of mine said, you only have to brush the teeth you want to keep. But I think a lot of DevOps and a lot of, whether it's platform engineering or agile stuff, is like that. Like, the people who do the work should determine how the work is done. We know that's true, but we don't really follow it for some reason. And, maybe we should start doing that. Now, I don't think I'm going to start flossing because I got 3 kids and a busy work life and things like that. Where would I find the time? But at least in your work environment, maybe you can start shifting to following some of these practices. Well, thanks. You can send a bill at bill@mail.com for helping me out with my therapy here. But if you're interested in more of those things, I have all sorts of stuff. But it's easy enough to kind of keep up with what I'm doing. And as my old friend Andrew Schaefer used to say, engage with my brand. And thank you. I appreciate the chance to talk with you.